Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 31 Media podcast. My name is Vaishnavi Nashte, and I'm the marketing and PR manager here at 31 Media. Today's podcast is in collaboration with the National DevOps Conference and Awards, or as we call it at 31 Media headquarters, the NDCA 2024. So if you are interested in attending or speaking at the conference, or even to exhibit any of your tech solutions to our delegates, please follow the link in the description. Today on the podcast, I'm pleased to have Rob Reid, who is a tech evangelist at Cockroach Labs. How are you today, Rob?
Very well, thank you, Vaishnavi. Thank you for having me today.
No worries. It's great to have you on the podcast. So, to begin with, can you give our listeners a bit of an overview regarding continuous integration and continuous deployment?
Sure. So I've experienced continuous integration and deployment CI/CD as more of a consumer
Hmm.
as opposed to someone in DevOps or SRE orchestrating those pipelines. I have had a fair amount to do with it later on in my career,
Yeah.
but the bulk of it, I've just been either subject to not having it or reaping the benefits of having it, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes any sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Kind of.
so, so in so my background in CI/CD kind of actually centers around more of my mental health. If it's,
Mm,
I know it's a left field take on it, but to give you some context, I started my career before CI/CD really took off. So
mm-hmm.
I grew up, so to speak, in the world of a kind of hero dev culture whereby
Mm-hmm.
devs will wake up very early in the morning and start a release at say 2 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully it comes back up online and the business is able to continue at 7 a.m. But the onus of all that manual tinkering and release process is on the developer. And that typically
Mm-hmm.
was someone like me. And
Yeah.
that had an enormously negative impact on my well-being.
Mm-hmm.
For the 2 weeks leading up to any
Mm-hmm.
kind of release, my
Yeah.
stomach would be in knots. I would be panicking. I'd be irritable it just wasn't good for me. And then my
Yeah.
first stint in a company with a solid CI/CD process, it was a complete game changer for me. I I could release software, having confidence that that software wasn't going to break everything, or at least
Mm-hmm.
it had a much lower chance of breaking everything.
Yeah.
And there were structures in place like feature toggles and things like that that
Mm-hmm.
gave everyone in the organization confidence that they could release their software Dart, i.e., it's not being actively used by users. They could toggle it on
Mm-hmm.
to a
Mm-hmm.
small portion of users, and they could toggle it off if it didn't work.
Yeah.
So that for me was the point at which I decided that in any organization, tech organization that I joined, I would want to either join an organization that had a good CI/CD process in place or
Yeah.
be open to include the adoption of a CI/CD
Yeah.
process because I think it's, in my own opinion, I think it's the only way to sensibly and safely release software.
Mm-hmm. I think it makes work a lot more easier as well because, as you mentioned, it has like probably a lot of impact on your mental health. But yeah, amazing to have that part of the story.
Yeah, it also just do you want to you it looks like you're about to ask a question. You go ahead.
Oh, no, no, no. Go ahead, go ahead.
It's also just quicker.
Yeah,
If I want to, it gave me confidence in breaking things, if that makes sense. So to
yeah,
give you some context on that, if I was to do a big refactor, a big change to a code base, I
yeah.
would feel much more confident in making that change if I knew that I had a
Mm,
CI/CD like a CI pipeline that was going to
right.
make my code fail
Mm,
if it was all broken.
mm,
That allowed me to be a braver and bolder
mm.
developer. I had the
Yeah.
confidence in myself, and more importantly, the tooling that was between me and my users in making
Mm-hmm.
those bold decisions. I think I would probably shied away from half the changes I've made in those code
Yeah.
bases if I didn't have that, because the only thing
Mm,
protecting me from my users is my confidence in my own changes.
yeah.
And hopefully, and some of those changes are sweeping, but
Yeah.
but the CI process gets you into a rhythm. It forces you to think about the size and scope of your changes. I can make
Mm,
lots of very small changes, commit them all, they can all go to production, and I stand to make a much lower impact to anything
yeah.
if that
Yeah.
change is only very small.
Yeah, I
Where
mean,
I've been
it's been a
in the
game
past,
changer, I think.
it has. I
Yeah.
know some companies still operate on the premise of there's a release board of people.
Mm, mm,
You as a developer or a team go to represent your change at this release review board with
yeah.
your, it might be two sheets of paper, well, in some instances two documents, one for
Mm,
staging, one for production. They'll flick through and tell you if you can release or not. If you can release, you'll take your piece of paper or
mm,
document to someone on the release team who will go through
yeah.
it and manually deploy it.
Mm,
And
mm,
I've seen so many more issues with that because
yeah.
not only are my changes going out, they're also quite big changes because the time between releases is greater,
Mm,
and they tend to be big bang releases.
right.
My team are releasing something, another team are releasing something. 10 minutes later, I get a call from someone whose world has just exploded because of my
Yeah.
changes.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm releasing intraday during business
Mm,
hours, I've got the
mm,
support of my whole team around me to do it. And if anything goes wrong, it's all automated. I switch it back, and the
mm.
fix is near instantaneous.
Oh,
But
wow.
interestingly,
Mm,
I've only ever experienced one production issue during
mm.
during the course of my career that was backed by CI/CD.
Okay, which was,
User error, like
okay.
coding error.
Mm,
Um,
mm, mm.
but it only happened once. Typically, like
Okay,
I CI/CD for me, so the kind of the relationship in my mind of CI/CD is CI is everything that happens up to but not including the point of deployment, and
right.
CD is everything that happens after that.
Mm,
The relationship between the two is intrinsic. You can't
mm-hmm.
do, you should never do CD without having done CI, because CI is the
Right.
bit that should break if there's any problems, not CD and everything
Mm,
beyond it, because everything beyond it is users and customers.
mm-hmm. Wow, that's an amazing insight. Yeah, I think having like both of them sort of the dependency, it's great to highlight that. So thank you. My next question to you is how do these practices really relate to each other? Like, can you give our listeners a bit more insight into how they can get better at understanding this?
So, as I touched upon, the relationship for me, it's intrinsic. You can
Right.
have, it's good practice to have CI without
Mm-hmm.
CD. If
Mm-hmm.
you're continuously integrating your code into a main branch and you're testing it
Mm-hmm.
in an automated fashion, even if that code doesn't automatically go anywhere, it's a good process. So I would advocate people to use CI even if they're not using CD, but I would never
Mm-hmm.
advocate anyone to use continuous deployment without having it had that code gone through a CI pipeline first.
Right.
Because
Right.
like CI for me is the gatekeeper. That's the thing that should break if there's anything wrong in the code. I
Mm-hmm.
would want CI to fail fast and tell me that it's failed before my customers ringing me up and saying that something has failed. That means there's a
Yeah.
problem in my CI process that
Mm-hmm.
hasn't captured that error.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Amazing. Cool. And what do you think like are the benefits of each of these practices though? I
Well,
mean, we did
CI,
touch upon like, it has been a game changer, but would you be able to list out like certain key benefits for our
hmm,
listeners for each of the practice?
CI gives you the confidence in doing CD. So that's like one enormous benefit
Right.
of CI. Another benefit of CI is that your main branch of code, the code that should always be in a fit state to be deployed to production, is always in a healthy
Mm,
state. It's
mm,
continuously being tested.
yeah.
Your assumptions on that code are always being asserted,
Yeah.
such that if you needed to release that code at the drop of a hat, you know it's
Mm,
healthy. You know you can. You can deploy it at a moment's notice.
mm,
If you make a change, if you need to make a small change, if you need to make a small feature,
mm,
you can make it immediately. You can
yeah.
test it immediately, and you can deploy it immediately. So it gives you a lot of velocity when it comes to getting features and value into your
Mm,
customers' hands.
mm,
Whereas in the traditional world of software development, you would, and especially if you talk about Prince 2 and the waterfall models of software
Yeah.
development. You plan it, you
Mm.
build it, you test it, you might need to develop it again, you might need to test it again.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bit of a feedback loop, and then you
Yeah.
release it. And that might be a month later, that might be a quarter later.
Mm.
By that point, your customers, if they're waiting, especially if they're waiting on that
Yeah.
feature, they may have gone elsewhere.
True. True. Making things a lot more quicker for sure in that case.
And especially when you tie things, tools like infrastructure as code, Terraform
Mm.
and the like into the
Mm.
process, because not only can then you can then deploy at a moment's notice, you can redeploy, you can re-platform at a moment's notice. I like to think of CI/CD as in, and this is just a way I like to think about it, as tending to grasslands. I don't want to have to be on my hands
Okay.
and knees trimming blades of
Yeah.
grass to keep
Yeah.
everything looking nice. I want to be able to just take a
Mm.
flamethrower to the grass and have
Yeah. Do it all at once.
the ground
Yeah.
rebuild it for me.
Yeah.
Because, and that was the world I was in before. I was on my hands and knees clipping
Mm.
grass, which is the analogy of being on a production server, typing in commands and hoping you don't type in the wrong command,
Mm.
to just
Well,
destroying the whole environment and
yeah.
having everything rebuild automatically for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's that's a good analogy. Okay, cool.
Well,
Um,
that's just CI. The benefits of CD
yeah.
are, we touched on it, I suppose, but it's the reproducibility. If
Mm.
I do things 1,000 times myself manually,
Mm-hmm.
20% of the time at best, 40% of the time at worst, I'll be doing
Mm.
things differently and probably wrong.
Yeah.
If I code something once, maybe tweak it a little bit as I find problems with it, that can execute with reproducibility every time. So every release is the same, every release is tested,
Mm-hmm.
and prior to that, prior to CI, prior to CD, everything was ad hoc. Everything was by the seat of our pants. You did
Mm-hmm.
something, you hoped it worked, you did it the next time, you might do it differently, you might break everything.
Yeah.
It put the onus on a safe release on a human, which, as we know, is
Right.
fraught.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Cool. That brings me to my next question, which is, in your opinion, what are the best practices for CI/CD?
Treat everything as disposable. There's an analogy that people use, or a metaphor, where you treat your infrastructure as
Yeah.
cattle and not as pets,
Okay.
because then you're in the world of tending. I don't want to be in
Mm.
the world of tending. It comes back to my grasslands analogy.
Yeah.
I want to have the confidence to tear everything down and have the ground take care of the automation of the grass.
Yeah.
The grass shouldn't be my responsibility,
Mm.
nor should my machines. I don't want to have to manage a machine. I don't want to have to manage a build. I want the technology to take care of that for me. And I think you should automate as much as possible. That's the deployment, but that's also the testing. I'm not saying we don't need testers. We absolutely do need testers as part of a healthy software development lifecycle.
Mm.
Do I think testers and developers should be testing every permutation of whatever could happen, right or wrong, in a software code base? Perhaps not. I
Mm.
think that's a
Mm-hmm.
waste of people's time, especially when it comes to making tweaks to code and needing
Yeah.
to regression test that, making sure you haven't introduced bugs or reintroduced old bugs.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it all comes down to confidence. Building, I write code, I write tests. Testers write tests. They might be automated UI tests. They might be automated API tests.
Mm-hmm.
They might be manual tests, but I think CI puts you in the mindset of the only tests I manually run are exploratory tests. The tests that I run as a
Right.
tester to try and break something. I shouldn't
Mm.
have to I shouldn't have to manually run happy path tests, because
Yeah.
it's taxing. And again, the more I'm doing manually as a developer or a tester, the more that is going to go wrong eventually, because
Mm.
I'm not infallible as a human.
Yeah.
So that's the benefit. I think it's
Mm.
reproducibility at every level. You reduce
Yeah.
the amount of time that humans need to be tinkering, and you reduce the amount that human needs to be exposed to a production environment, because we're
Mm.
dangerous. We humans are dangerous to a production environment, and
Yeah.
the more we can automate ourselves out of production, the safer. Especially
Yeah.
when it comes to if you think about audits, software
Right.
audits, if you can't show an auditor that your team aren't constantly on production machines with access to production data,
Mm.
then that's a failed audit, especially in a very tightly regulated industry. If you can
Right.
show them that your changes are small, they get automatically tested with a good coverage of tests, maybe not
Mm.
100% code coverage, decent code coverage, and then they go out to the users where the developers have zero access to the production environment. I think that puts you in a much healthier position as a software team.
Yeah, you mentioned something about testing before, and I've had like a lot of like podcasters, like basically people on the podcast talking about the balance between manual and automated testing. I'm curious, like, what's your perspective on that? What would your suggestion be to our viewers to sort of achieve that balance? What part of the process should be manual versus what part should be automated?
Good question. I don't think there's a silver bullet, but then I'm not a
Yeah,
testing professional. I've worked
yeah.
with some very talented testing engineers in the past, and their mantra was they don't manually test the happy path. They automate
Mm,
that away such that if there are any regressions to the happy path, the tests will fail.
mm-hmm.
And anything they're testing to push the boundaries of the system, to
Right.
test the edge cases, they perform what they called exploratory testing. And
Mm,
and the way they did it was really interesting. They'd create mind maps of what they wanted
mm-hmm.
to test, with the feature being in the middle, and all of the different kinds of things they wanted to explore around it in a
Mm-hmm.
mind map,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd work their way through it. Obviously, you would probably want to automate some of that. So,
Mm,
for example, whenever a new bug was found, an automated test would be put in place to cover it.
mm, mhm.
Have we fixed the bug?
Yeah.
Great. Next release, is it still fixed, or have we broken it
Mm,
again? So
mhm.
so it was very much a concerted effort that we had broken down the wall between dev and test. There was no more my code is ready, go and test it, because
Mm,
I think that's a very unhealthy dynamic between members of the same team. Rather, working together to ensure code coverage, to ensure
yeah.
that what you think is fixed is really fixed and is permanently fixed,
Mhm.
is a collaborative effort between developers and testers.
Mhm. Got it. Got it.
But the amount of time we save by doing that is staggering. I worked in a company once where I'd be put up in a hotel, and
Mhm.
I'd wake up at 1 a.m. I'd travel into the office from my London hotel to get
1
into the
a.m.
office at, yep, to get into the
Okay.
office at 2.
Yeah.
Sometimes the office would be open. Sometimes the person who was supposed to open the office would forget to open the office. But most of the time the office was open.
Yeah.
I'd sit at my desk, I'd start my I'd start my release process, and it would be me and a tester. The amount of time we would have saved by having CI/CD in place
Mm,
is ridiculous.
yeah.
So the release process itself, I worked out that had I stayed at that company for 5 years, I would have saved 5 weeks of effort
Oh my
in just
gosh.
manually releasing
Mm,
software. Testing, we would have saved 10 months. And that was
mm,
because I'd make a small fix. I'd ask them to test it. They'd go and test it. They'd
yeah.
find a bug in it. It'd come back to me. I'd go and test it again. They'd test
Yeah.
it again. That bit was fixed, but this part was broken. An old colleague of mine suggested that the development process is like a sausage balloon. You squeeze it here, another bug
Mm,
pops out here.
mm,
You
mm.
squeeze that one, another one pops up here.
Yeah.
So we work in this sausage balloon factory of bugs, or at least I did in my case. But we only
Mm.
got into that situation because probably from my lack of skill in some areas, but
Yeah.
the fact that we didn't have an automated coverage of those tests. So I could make a small change and it wasn't
Mm,
tested over here, so I'd break something
mm.
over here. And it was quite a sprawling code base. So you imagine you've got the confidence to make a small change, but then your confidence is crushed when you realize you've broken something over here.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's nothing quite like a confidence shake like that that says this process isn't working. We need to
Mm,
change our process now, and we need to go with something more automated because
yeah.
it's not good for anyone. It's not good for us. It's not good for our code base, and it's not good for our users.
Mm. I can almost say that there's a lot of there's obviously a lot of advantages for it to be, in terms of team collaborations as well. Do you have like any experiences right now where you can see that things have been a lot more smoother for you in terms of team collaboration as well by the deployment of, CI/CD?
Yeah, I think the smoothness is part and parcel of CI/CD.
Mm,
So, but it does take an investment up front, and it can be
yeah.
quite a large investment. The company I worked at with the best CI/CD process, it took them 10 years to
Oh my
get
God.
not the CI/CD process in place,
Okay.
but the mindset of CI/CD, the mindset of we need to build cross-functional development teams with developers, testers, product owners, scrum
Yeah.
masters, people like that, and seek the buy-in from the top because you can create your cross-functional multidiscipline teams, but if you're working in one of the companies that extol the benefits of Prince 2 and the waterfall way of working, it's not going to work. You're always going to be butting heads with management. They're not going to be happy. You're not going to be
Mm,
happy. They'll think you're investing too much time in automation,
yeah.
but the payoff comes later. I think the payoff in smoothness, velocity, and probably cost savings, general
Mm,
total cost of ownership, are greatly reduced once you've got that automation in place. It's
yeah.
just it's it's taking the red pill up front and
All right.
making the decision to 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 take the leap. Because if you're
Yeah.
doing something, if you're working with the release notes and everything's manual, but everything's more or less working, the
Mm,
tendency is not to change it, especially not to make a large or just any kind of investment in something new because you've got something
yeah.
that's seemingly working.
Mm, mm,
So I would encourage anyone with that's still doing manual deployments to invest in some kind of automation. It doesn't have to be a
mm,
big bang. You could try and automate your tests. You could try and automate. I would automate your tests before you automate your deployments. I think there
mm,
there is a structure that has to happen first. First, you need to build the confidence in your product and the
mm,
reliability and robustness of your product, and that comes through
mm,
CI. Giving your developers a build failure instead of a production issue is the first step. Once you've got your code into a position where you can trust it,
mm,
then you can start to invest in automating more. And by the time
yeah.
you're finished on your automation journey, you've probably automated quite a lot of out of the equation. And I think a last step to a really healthy automated environment is feature flags.
Mm,
Companies like Launch Darkly do offer amazing products in allowing development teams to toggle software on and off. You
yeah.
can do what we call dark releases, whereby you release software to a production environment, but it's not being used. It's not toggled on. Then you
Mm,
toggle it on for one user, 10% of users, 100% of users,
okay.
and you see how it goes. Then you're in the world
Right.
of blue, green, or canary deployments where you can try stuff. You can try something. Your testing can then occur in production in a safe
Right.
way. You've tested it in the dev environment. You've tested it in the test environment, maybe UAT, staging, whatever environments you
Mm,
have, and
mm,
now you can test it with one user in production.
right.
Do they get a good experience? Yes,
Mm,
cool. Toggle it on for some more. And by that point, you've maybe toggled it on for everyone, and later on you can remove the toggle. You've
yeah.
it sounds like there are more moving
A/B
parts.
testing kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It sounds there are more moving parts in this,
Mm,
but each of those moving parts is a preventative measure from
mm,
from a production issue.
mm. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, my final question to you is what was your first-hand experience with CI/CD? And I know you sort of touched on that a little bit regarding the smoothness of collaboration, but could you like elaborate a bit more on your first experience?
So my first hand experience, release notes don't
Mm,
protect production.
Yeah.
Release teams don't protect production. They don't catch bugs. They don't catch every kind of
Yeah.
bug, because I think for a developer to have a complete holistic insight into their code base, especially a large code base, is very difficult. Now,
Yeah.
that becomes much more difficult when there are two people in the team. I don't have
Mm.
visibility on everyone else's code base. So in a large development team, release notes don't protect you. CI/CD is the only thing that can protect you and catch bugs. You're not going to catch every bug, but at
Mm.
least hopefully you're screening out a lot of the stupid bugs that we all make.
Right.
Release notes don't allow teams to achieve high velocity in the same way that CI/CD does,
Mm.
because there's that manual barrier to deploy. CI/CD
Mm-hmm.
removes that barrier to deploy. It puts up a very healthy middle ground,
Yeah.
like a battleground for your code. If your code passes that battleground, yeah, it deserves to go into production. Hero cultures aren't healthy. So rewarding people for fixing something in production, I think, is less healthy than rewarding them for preventing the issue in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Spending time preventing an issue is invisible. It's time spent
Yeah.
in and money spent in a non-feature. The
Mm-hmm.
person at the top of the company doesn't see it as a product. The end user doesn't see it as a product. They
Mm-hmm.
sure as hell will when everything goes down and everything's unavailable. So I personally call the method of rewarding people more for fixing issues a hero culture. And I've worked in the
Mm.
majority of companies I've ever been in have been hero cultures where they
Yeah.
reward people for swinging in and saving the day. I
Yeah.
don't I Yeah, of course, yeah, pat on the back, well done, you've saved the day. But if we let it happen again,
Mm.
that same kind of issue, then we're doing something wrong as a business. We should be
Yeah.
rewarding people greater for or recognizing efforts in preventing those things. That is,
Yeah.
I think, the real culture that we should be driving for.
Mm-hmm.
There are no heroes, or at least the heroes are less visible, but
Yeah.
overall the team are much happier and much healthier.
Mm. Mm.
The biggest the biggest positive impact that CI/CD has had on me is, one of them is faster features, for
Mm.
sure, greater customer
Mm.
value, but for me it's been my mental health. It's it's been the
Amazing.
confidence in releasing software and not feeling
Mm.
sick to my stomach about doing it.
Yeah. Making work like so much more easier, isn't it? And
Exactly.
enjoyable.
It makes
Yeah.
everything smoother, it makes everything more enjoyable, it makes everything safer.
Yeah.
It makes me a better person when I'm out of work.
Yeah. I can relate to that for sure. Okay. Thank you so much for all of your insights today. And thank you for being on the 31 Media podcast. It was
Thank you
lovely
for having
to
me.
have a chat with you.
Yeah, and you. Thank you very much.
Amazing.